Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of the Franks, and the creation of Charlemagne's empire. Today is episode 2, The Barbarians Are at the Gates. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, the Roman Empire had expanded until the Mediterranean became a Roman lake. However, the empire failed to produce a stable succession system. After generations of bloody revolts, a general named Diocletian seized power in 283 and divided the empire into the western half and the eastern half, recognizing that it was too large to be ruled by a single emperor. Despite his best efforts, a civil war broke out soon after his death, and Constantine had become sole emperor by 323. Byzantium became his capital in order to better deal with the expansionist Sasanian dynasty in Persia. When he died, the empire was divided again. However, Germanic tribes were pressing against the northern borders. When roughly 100,000 Goths appeared in the summer of 376 on the northern side of the Danube River, local commanders were stunned, but they eventually learned that the Goths had been driven from their homes by the Huns. Little is known about the origins of the Huns other than they were Turkic-speaking nomads who would become dominant in the grasslands north of the Black Sea. While it would be natural to conclude that the Goths were preparing to invade, you would be wrong. Instead, they had lined up patiently to apply for entry permits to the empire. Such a large number of people was beyond the authority of the local immigration agents, so a small group of representatives was allowed to travel 1,000 miles to Antioch to meet the emperor. Meanwhile, the Goths continued to wait patiently on their side of the Danube. Given their ability to wait patiently, these Goths do not seem to have been refugees who had fled bands of rampaging Huns with whatever they could carry. Instead, they had realized that their neighborhood had become unstable and would likely become dangerous in the near future, so they had decided to emigrate to a more stable region, which basically meant the empire. So they seem to have been economic migrants, just armed economic migrants. Emperor Valens approved the Goths' request because they would provide troops. Actually, the empire had accepted large numbers of migrants before. Testosterone-fueled young men would become auxiliary soldiers, and their more stable relatives would become peasant farmers. Admittedly, the initial adjustment to tens of thousands or even more than 100,000 new arrivals could be a tricky situation, but not a serious problem as long as a couple of legions were nearby. Except the border region had few troops because Valens needed them against the Persians, which is why he had been in Antioch in the first place, rather than Constantinople, the actual capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Clearly, Valens examined the immigration applications carefully, since only one of the two separate groupings of Goths was admitted. The available troops in the region were moved to ensure that the rejected group remained on its side of the neighbor. The available troops in the region were moved to ensure that the rejected group remained on its side of the river. The stable Goths handed over hostages and some young men to serve as auxiliaries on the eastern front. If the situation was managed smoothly, they would settle down and become property owners who complained about taxes and the weather with their new neighbors. However, the situation was managed badly. The new arrivals had been promised food, but corruption or incompetence meant that the food did not arrive. Hungry, armed men are dangerous, and they revolted. Honestly, it would have been a challenge to feed so many people, and it became harder because a large army had to be supplied on the eastern front. Open revolt was avoided, but the troops guarding the border were needed to supervise the new arrivals, which enabled the second group to cross the river. The situation continued to spiral downwards, so local commanders were instructed to invite prominent Goths to a banquet and then arrest them for use as hostages. The attempted capture provoked resistance, and the two groups of Goths united to pillage throughout Thrace. The Romans retaliated and won a victory, but Huns and Alans crossed the river, attracted by the chance to loot. Valens was trying to shift troops away from the Persian front, but he was also waiting for his western counterpart Gratian to bring his army. Unfortunately, Gratian had his own problems with another Germanic tribe, the Alemanni, that repeatedly crossed the Rhine River. So Valens discovered that he would have to face the Goths on his own. Unknown to Valens, Gratian was on his way after an admittedly lengthy delay, but Valens apparently saw an opportunity for a glorious solo victory. Valens may have been eager to win a glorious victory against the Goths because he had become co-emperor simply because his older brother Valentinian had been elected emperor and needed a co-emperor. Valentinian had died a year earlier but had been succeeded by his two sons, Gratian and Valentinian. So, technically, there were three emperors, Valens and his two nephews, although the two nephews shared the western half of the empire. Eager for a victory to strengthen his position as emperor, Valens moved to Adrianople, where he discovered that he was greatly outnumbered. After heavy fighting, the Roman army broke. Thousands of Roman soldiers died, possibly more than 10,000, including Valens. There were few troops remaining in the region, so the Goths suddenly controlled the Balkan provinces. Actually, it would be more accurate to say that they could wander at will, but they had failed to capture the largest population centers where most of the food was stored. So they wandered around pillaging in order to survive, but they could not settle down because no single region could feed them for long. Also, the Western Empire was able to block any attempts to move west, so they were confined to Thrace. When Valens died at Adrianople, 19-year-old Gratian needed a new co-emperor. His half-brother Valentinian was too young, so he turned to Theodosius, son of a general who had succeeded in Britain a decade earlier. Theodosius proved to be a good choice since he forced the Goths to surrender in 382. Actually, the arrangement was less of a surrender and more of an agreement to stop fighting. The key point is that the Goths never suffered any consequences for the death of an emperor, the destruction of an army, and the widespread pillaging. The Goths were given sizable blocks of land to farm for themselves. In return, they supplied the usual number of recruits for the army, but also large, autonomous forces of Goths, led by Goths, which would limit the possibility of the new arrivals assimilating. Remember, Theodosius had been appointed emperor in January 379, and he had been trying to defeat the Goths since then. He had failed, which explains the decision to adopt a new, more tolerant approach 3 years later. This policy was undoubtedly perceived as a humiliation at the time, but there was peace for over a decade. Unfortunately, instability increased in the west when Gratian was killed in 383 by an usurper named Maximus. Theodosius could do little since he was busy with the Persians and the Huns, so Maximus became Western Emperor, well, except for Italy, where 12-year-old Valentinian ruled from Milan, guided by his advisors. After 4 years, Maximus had gained sufficient support to cross the Alps, so Valentinian fled to Thessalonica. Theodosius agreed to support Valentinian's campaign to retake the Western Roman Empire, although there is little evidence that Maximus was a bad emperor, nor did he directly challenge Theodosius. However, Theodosius had married into the imperial family when he married Galla, Valentinian's half-sister. The campaign started in June 388, and Maximus did not last long. Captured after a few brief battles, he was executed, and Theodosius made a triumphal entry into Rome with Valentinian by his side on June 13, 389. 2 years later, Theodosius returned to Constantinople, leaving Valentinian as the unchallenged emperor of the West. Except Arbogast the Frank had been appointed governor of Gaul, and he had zero interest in the opinion of a young man who had been unable to defend his throne against an usurper. A public meeting where Valentinian attempted to force his authority on the governor did not go well, and the emperor was found dead on May 15, 392. As a non-Roman, Arbogast could not simply appoint himself emperor, so he appointed an ally, Eugenius, former head of the imperial chancery, as emperor. A politely worded letter was sent to Theodosius, informing him of an unfortunate accident involving his brother-in-law and the decision to make Eugenius emperor. It is hard to know if Theodosius had any emotional attachment to Valentinian, but he definitely reacted badly to the news. The key issue was authority. Valentinian had been a junior emperor, yes, but a junior emperor who answered to Theodosius. Eugenius was a puppet, but a puppet of Arbogast. Actually, Arbogast's candidate was accepted in Italy because he adopted a policy of religious toleration towards pagans, which was welcomed by the old aristocracy, many of whom remained pagan. Theodosius was determined to restore Christian dominance, but in particular, his dominance. Fortunately, he had a large army, having recruited many Goths, the same Goths who had killed Emperor Valens at Adrianople 13 years earlier. It is worth mentioning that many of the Goths were formal members of the Roman legions, following a tradition of ethnic minorities advancing in society through military service. However, many Goths were fighting as Goths under Goth chieftains, allied with the emperor, yes, but separate from the imperial army. One of those chieftains was a young man named Alaric. So, Theodosius was ready to enforce some discipline on the western half of the empire, and his mood was probably not helped by the recent death of his beloved wife Galla. They had been married for 7 years, but had only produced a single child, their daughter, Galla Placidia. As ever, it is worth asking if this civil war was necessary. Eugenius had the backing of the local authorities, notably the aristocracy in Rome, and Arbogast had made no aggressive moves eastwards. In fact, Theodosius had basically had to rely on armed barbarians to raise a large enough army, which set a dangerous precedent. Anyway, there was a bloody 2-day battle in early September near Trieste. Theodosius was the victor, Eugenius surrendered and was beheaded. Arbogast escaped but soon killed himself. Theodosius then marched to Milan, where he was surprisingly lenient with Arbogast's former supporters. However, he needed a new emperor in the west, so he instructed his niece Serena to escort his younger son Honorius to Milan, which had replaced Trier as the new capital of the Western Roman Empire. Unfortunately, Theodosius was ill and died on January 17, 395, 50 years old. Since Honorius had already been appointed emperor, the succession should have been smooth, but he was 10, which is a little young to rule an empire. Obviously, he would need an advisor, and Theodosius's second-in-command, Stilicho, accepted the responsibility. Although Theodosius had not made a formal announcement, Stilicho claimed that the emperor had told him privately to serve as advisor to his young son. Since Stilicho was in charge of the army, no one appeared willing to ask for something in writing. Actually, Stilicho seemed an odd choice for regent, since he was the son of a Vandal chieftain. However, he had impressed the emperor, who had permitted his marriage to his niece Serena, who was more like a daughter. So, Stilicho, generalissimo for the Western Roman Empire, became Honorius's guardian. Since Stilicho's base was in the east, it would have been natural to appoint someone familiar with the region to advise Honorius and return to Constantinople. However, Theodosius's older son Arcadius was nearly 18 and already had advisors who did not seem enthusiastic about Stilicho's return, which probably explained his decision to remain in Milan despite his lack of any real network in the west. Speaking of Arcadius's advisors, the rivalry between them was fierce. Initially, Arcadius was guided by the ambitious Praetorian prefect Rufinus, but Rufinus was eventually killed by the emperor's soldiers, apparently because he did not conceal his desire to become co-emperor. Well, at least there would be peace, since the usurper had been killed. No. Actually, a revolt soon erupted in the Eastern Roman Empire. Who would revolt, you ask? Remember I mentioned that one of those independent groups of armed Goths was led by Alaric? When Eugenius was defeated, Alaric seems to have marched back to the Balkans and rebelled in order to get fed. Once again, this may have been simple anger against administrative screw-ups regarding food. The empire had just been forcibly reunited after an expensive campaign, and then the emperor died. In the Eastern Roman Empire, there was a young emperor without a clear regent. Instead, several powerful men struggled against each other for influence, which probably did not help the bureaucracy. So, the Goths revolted, but nothing had changed dramatically 2 years later, other than more farms and towns in the Balkans had been pillaged. The Eastern Roman Empire remained strong enough to keep the Goths contained in the Balkans, but could not force them to submit. Rather than waste lives in futile battles, Eutropius, the most powerful of Arcadius's advisors, negotiated a treaty with Alaric in 397 that satisfied most of the Goths' demands. However, he lost a power struggle with his rivals, partially because he was attacked for his weakness towards the Goths, and he fell from power in 399. The treaty was promptly torn up by his successors. A year later, the senior Goth commander in the army was killed, along with many Goth soldiers, by rioting residents of the capital. If official policy in the Eastern Empire would be anti-Goth, then it was probably time to leave. The Goths marched west in 401, but they were defeated by Stilicho in 402. Actually, the battle may have been more of a draw, since Alaric retreated to nearby Pannonia, where he was left alone. Again, there is no clear evidence, but Alaric and his Goths were left alone for 3 years. Either he received a formal command from Stilicho with responsibility for a key border region, or Alaric had found an ideal region sufficiently far from the core regions of each empire that neither could be bothered to deal with him. There is no clear record either way, but I suspect that a deal with Stilicho is more likely. While the Goths had failed to enter Italy, they had threatened Milan, so the capital was moved to Ravenna because it was considered safe and it had a large port. By this time, it appeared that the Goths were stuck, and their future would have been grim if the two halves of the empire had managed to cooperate. But relations between the two courts were chilly at best. Since Stilicho had spent most of his career in Constantinople, he should have been able to cooperate well with his opposite number. Instead, the two courts avoided open warfare but failed completely to have any form of cooperation. Probably because the advisors in Constantinople knew that Stilicho would like to become the power between two thrones. To sum up, tens of thousands of Goths had been permitted to enter the Eastern Roman Empire because the Huns had made their old neighborhood dangerous. When food supplies did not arrive on schedule, tensions escalated until there was a battle at Adrianople where Emperor Valens died, along with most of his army. Valens' successor Theodosius finally negotiated peace in exchange for greater autonomy for the Goths. Actually, the Goths would provide invaluable manpower when Theodosius dealt with two separate usurpers in the Western Roman Empire. He had gained control of both halves of the empire by 395, but he died soon after. Fortunately, he had two sons. Arcadius, the eldest, would rule in the east, and Honorius received the west, guided by Stilicho, Theodosius's senior general. Meanwhile, the Goths united under Alaric and revolted. Attempts to expand east and then west failed, so their future outlook appeared grim. However, the situation in the west became complicated, giving Alaric an opportunity, which I will discuss next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.